Zola Collins had a theory about best friends. She believed that a real best friend was not found. She was built, layer by layer, through shared meals and borrowed sweaters and the kind of 3 in the morning phone calls where nobody had to explain why they were crying. She believed that best friends were forged the way steel was forged. Under heat, under pressure, through trials that would have driven ordinary acquaintances into silence and distance. And she believed, with the conviction of a woman who had lived every word of it, that her best friend in the entire world, in all of history, in all of the known universe and whatever came after it, was Park Soo-yeon. They had found each other in the autumn of their sophomore year of college. Wedged together by alphabetical seating in an introduction to literature class neither of them had wanted to take. Zola had been running 10 minutes late, her locks pinned up haphazardly, a coffee cup in one hand and 3 highlighters in the other. She had dropped 2 of those highlighters the moment she tried to pull out her chair. Soo-yeon, already seated, already organized, had picked them both up without being asked and set them on Zola's side of the shared desk without making it a moment, without making it a gesture, without looking up from her notebook. Just a small, quiet kindness extended to a stranger, completely unprompted, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Zola had looked at her. Soo-yeon had looked back. Something had clicked into place that neither of them could have named then, though they would spend the next 10 years trying. They were wildly different on the surface and identical underneath, which was the particular alchemy of great friendships. Soo-yeon was meticulous and methodical, the kind of person who color-coded her planner and prepared for every scenario 3 steps in advance and never, ever missed a deadline. Zola was instinctive and electric, the kind of person who solved problems by feeling her way through them, by talking them out loudly, by moving through space until the answer appeared somewhere in the motion. Soo-yeon was quiet in public and explosive in private, reserving her full self for the people who had earned it. Zola was loud everywhere, always, at all times, and made no apologies for it and never would. Soo-yeon planned vacations 6 months out. Zola had once booked a flight 4 hours before departure and called it spontaneity. Soo-yeon had called it something else. They were, as Soo-yeon's mother liked to say with a warm and slightly baffled smile while watching them argue about something completely insignificant at the dinner table, 2 different birds who had decided to share one nest and were somehow both happier for it. And what a nest it was! Zola had been absorbed into the Park family with a completeness that still sometimes made her chest ache with a gratitude she didn't have adequate words for. It had not happened all at once. It had happened the way most real things happened, slowly, incrementally, through the accumulation of small moments that only revealed their weight in retrospect. The first Chuseok dinner she was invited to, awkward and overwhelmed and trying to hold her chopsticks correctly under the table where nobody would see. The second one, a little less awkward. The third, where Mrs. Park had simply handed her an apron when she arrived and pointed toward the kitchen without any explanation, which Zola had understood was the highest form of welcome available in that household. She had learned to bow correctly when greeting the elders. She had learned how to hold her bowl close when eating soup. She had learned the particular rhythm of the Park household, the way Mrs. Park expressed love entirely through food and feeding, so that worry and affection and pride all arrived on a plate, steaming and abundant and impossible to refuse. The way Mr. Park communicated primarily through nods and the occasional pointed silence that somehow conveyed entire paragraphs. The way Soo-yeon's grandmother, Halmoni, watched everyone from her chair in the corner of the living room with eyes that had seen 83 years of the world and missed absolutely nothing, and who occasionally reached out to pat Zola's hand when she sat close enough. A gesture so gentle and deliberate that it felt, every single time, like a benediction. It had taken Zola about 3 years to stop feeling like a guest in their home and start feeling like a fixed feature of it. Like the good lamp in the living room, Soo-yeon had told her once, laughing so hard she had to put down her glass. You've just always been here. Nobody remembers when we got you, but nobody is moving you either. Zola had held onto that. She held onto it still. There was one element of the Park family, however, that remained slightly out of reach. One member who existed for her primarily in photographs and second-hand stories and the particular reverence with which the family said his name. Park Jun-seo, the older brother. The only son. He had been 24 years old when Zola first started coming around, already serving, already gone, already somewhere she couldn't picture clearly enough to make feel real. She had seen him in the family photographs arranged along the hallway wall. A series of them, spanning years, chronicling a boy becoming a young man and a young man becoming something more defined and deliberate. In the earliest ones he was maybe 15 or 16, lanky and slightly awkward the way teenage boys were, caught mid-laugh at something outside the frame. In the later ones he was older, broader, more settled in the space he occupied. In all of them he had a serious face with eyes that caught the light in an interesting way, like he was always thinking something he hadn't decided to say yet. She had seen him in the framed portrait in Mr. Park's study, in his dress uniform, looking formal and composed and entirely unreachable, like a person who had agreed to be captured in an image but had kept his actual self somewhere private, somewhere the camera couldn't follow. She had heard his name in passing, in the gentle, quietly proud way the family said it, as though the name itself carried weight. Jun-seo says this. Jun-seo thinks that. Jun-seo called last Sunday. Jun-seo will come home soon. Soon had kept stretching, the way soon always did when you were waiting for something important. One tour became two. A posting became an extended assignment that became another assignment. Suan had explained the pieces of it over the years in the way you explain things about a person you loved but had complicated feelings about missing, with pride and with the particular resigned affection of a younger sibling who had long since learned not to put timelines on things they couldn't control. Zola had assembled a portrait of him from those pieces. Dedicated. Serious. Too responsible for his own comfort, probably. Funny when you got to know him, according to Suan, who said it like it was classified information. He used to make their mother laugh so hard she had to sit down. He and their father had a relationship built on mutual stubbornness and mutual respect, the way many fathers and sons did, each one too similar to the other to say easily what they meant but both of them showing up anyway year after year in the ways that counted. But Zola had never met him. Not once in 10 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings and birthday celebrations and ordinary Tuesdays at that kitchen table. He was always somewhere else, always the photograph on the wall, always the name spoken with love and a little longing. And then, on a Thursday evening in early October, Mrs. Park called. Jun-seo was coming home. Really home. His service was complete. He was finished. He was coming for a family dinner on Saturday and would Zola please come, said with the particular urgency of a woman who did not like cooking for small numbers and also had a look in her voice, which was a thing Zola had learned to detect over the years, a tone underneath the words that meant more than the words said. Zola had laughed and said of course, absolutely. She wouldn't miss it. She had hung up the phone. She had thought about it for perhaps 45 seconds. She had imagined, briefly, the man from the photographs, the serious face, the uniform, the formal portrait in Mr. Park's study. Standing in the kitchen again after all those years, surrounded by his family, and she had thought, it will be lovely to finally meet him. It will be good for the family to have him back. This will be a nice dinner. She had not given the brother another thought after that. She should have given the brother considerably more thought. Saturday arrived the way the best autumn days did in their city, with a sky the color of faded denim, stretched wide and generous over the rooftops, an air that carried the smell of dry leaves and something faintly sweet and distant, like someone 3 blocks away was doing their baking with the windows open. It was the kind of morning that made you want to walk instead of taking the subway, that made the city feel like it had been set out specifically for you. Zola walked. She wore a rust-colored wrap dress because it was her favorite, and she always wore her favorite things to the Parks house, where she felt most like herself, where she didn't have to manage any version of herself that wasn't real. She had her locks down today, loose and long, with 2 small pieces pulled back from her face. She had put on earrings, the gold hoops, the good ones, because it was a celebration dinner and celebrations deserved the good earrings. She had brought wine and a box of the honey pastries from the Korean bakery near her apartment that Mrs. Park liked and would pretend were too much while eating 3 of them. She walked the 4 blocks from the station with her hands in her pockets and her favorite playlist doing what it always did, which was making the world feel like it had a score behind it, like she was the protagonist of something. She climbed the front steps of the Park's brick row house and knocked twice. 2 quick, familiar knocks, and then tried the door because it was never locked when the whole family was home, which Mrs. Park considered a form of welcome extended to the people who belonged here and Mr. Park tolerated because he had been overruled on it 20 years ago and had chosen his battles wisely since. The smell hit her before anything else. Something extraordinary was happening in that kitchen. She stood in the entryway and let it reach her, galbi. She was almost certain. Short ribs braised low and slow in soy and pear and ginger and brown sugar until the meat had surrendered entirely to tenderness. And beneath it, the glass noodle sweetness of japchae. And behind that, the sizzling, savory sweet smell of John frying in oil, the sound of it just audible from the kitchen. That particular hiss and pop that Zola associated with every good thing that had ever happened to her in this house. Her stomach turned over with immediate, uncomplicated joy. She called out her greeting in Korean, a phrase she had practiced until it felt like her own, until she didn't have to think about it, until it came out natural and warm. Mrs. Park's voice sailed back from the kitchen telling her to come in, take off her shoes, and also had she eaten anything today because she was looking thin, which she said to everyone regardless of what they actually looked like, because it was the opening move of her particular language of love. Zola was not thin. She was exactly herself. This was just how Mrs. Park said hello. She slipped off her shoes in the entryway and padded in her socks down the hallway, trailing her fingers along the wall the way she always did when she was comfortable somewhere, past the gallery of family photographs, past the children's school portraits and the holiday pictures and the snapshot of Mr. and Mrs. Park at what looked like a beach somewhere in the mid-90s where they were young and laughing, past the formal portrait of Jun-seo in his dress uniform that had always made her pause for just a half-second. She walked into the kitchen and stopped. She stopped so completely and so suddenly that she was faintly glad nobody was looking at her in that precise moment, because the expression on her face was not the composed and casually delighted expression of a woman arriving at a dinner she had attended 100 times. It was something else entirely. The man standing at the kitchen counter with his back to her was not a photograph. He was not a concept. He was not a collection of secondhand stories assembled over 10 years of Sunday dinners. He was real and he was present and he was occupying that kitchen with the kind of physical presence that changed the geometry of a room, that made you recalibrate the space around you without quite knowing why. He was taller than she had expected. The photographs, she would understand later, had not gotten the breadth of his shoulders right. There was a quality to how he carried himself that 2 dimensions simply could not convey. He was in dark jeans and a plain forest green Henley, sleeves pushed up to the elbows, and he was helping Mrs. Park at the counter with the calm, unhurried competence of someone who had done this exact thing 1,000 times and found nothing remarkable about it. He had his mother's hands, broad and capable, the hands of someone who made things. He had his father's posture, straight and quiet, taking up exactly the space he was supposed to take up and not a centimeter beyond it, which was a kind of discipline that expressed itself as grace. Then he turned around. He turned because his mother said something to him in Korean too rapid for Zola to follow, something that required his attention, and he turned from the counter and he looked across the kitchen and his eyes landed on Zola and she had absolutely no framework for what happened in his face in that moment. She had no prior experience to map it onto, no vocabulary adequate to describe it in the 3 seconds she had before she needed to be a normal human person who was not standing in a kitchen doorway having an inexplicable internal experience. It was not recognition because he didn't know her. It was not casual interest because it was too still and too deliberate for that. It was the look of a man who had just encountered something entirely unexpected and was taking careful, private stock of what it meant, what to do with it, whether he had understood correctly what he thought he was seeing. It was, she would think later, much later, lying on her ceiling staring at her ceiling in her apartment with the lights off, the look of a person who had been carrying a question for a very long time and had just, without warning, recognized the shape of an answer. Zola had been looked at many times in her life. She was a woman who moved through the world with the particular confidence of someone who had made peace with herself, who had decided long ago that taking up space was not a problem to be solved but a right to be exercised. She had been looked at with interest and admiration and curiosity and desire and occasionally with the infuriating particular quality of men who looked without truly seeing. She knew the full taxonomy of being looked at. This was none of those things. This was something she felt in a specific, inconvenient, and entirely unbidden location behind her sternum, like a tuning fork struck against the thing she hadn't known was there waiting to resonate. Mrs. Park, entirely oblivious to whatever was happening in the air between her son and her daughter's best friend, said in her bright and organizing voice, "Zolia, come, you are here. This is Jun-seo. Jun-seoya, this is Zola, Suyun's best friend. 10 years she has been coming here. She is like family. She is always here. Jun-seo set down the knife he'd been holding. He looked at her for another half a second that somehow managed to be both brief and substantial, like a word said very slowly. Then he smiled, and the smile was, it was the kind of smile that happened to serious people's faces the way light happened to water, unexpectedly transforming the whole surface of the thing. It was warm and a little slow, like he didn't give it out carelessly, like it meant something when it arrived, and it reached all the way up into his eyes, which Zola now saw were not just dark but had a depth and a steadiness to them that made her think irrationally and involuntarily of deep water, of the kind of water you couldn't see the bottom of and somehow weren't afraid of. "Zola," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. Like the man himself, she would understand eventually. Unhurried in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that speed and quality were not the same thing. "That's me," she said, which was not her finest moment conversationally but was what came out. Because she was Zola Collins and she always had something to say, and she had apparently used all her best material on the inside of her own head in the past 20 seconds. The corner of his mouth moved. "I've heard about you." She recovered slightly. "Good things, I hope." "Very good things," he said, and there was something in the specificity of the word very that she noticed and then firmly instructed herself not to think about. "Apparently you're the only person outside this family who has ever beaten my mother at Jangi." "I let her win sometimes," Zola said. "I want that to stay between us." Mrs. Park, who was standing approximately 3 feet away, said without turning from the stove, "You do not let me win. You are simply not as skilled as you believe yourself to be." "Iamoni," Jun-seo said, in a tone of gentle and practiced amusement, like a man who had been mediating this exact kind of exchange since childhood. "I think she might be." "You have been gone too long," Mrs. Park said. "You are taking the wrong side." He caught Zola's eye across the kitchen. There was a glint in his quick, warm, conspiratorial, and she felt the sternum thing again, stronger this time, and she turned deliberately toward the sink to wash her hands so she had something to do with her face. She passed close to him to get to the sink. The kitchen was not large, there was no architectural way around it, and he stepped back immediately to give her room, this natural and considerate half-step that gave her space without making an announcement of it, and she caught, briefly, the scent of him. Something clean and faintly woody. Cedar or something adjacent to cedar. Soap and something underneath the soap that was just him. A thing she would not, she decided firmly while turning on the faucet, be cataloging. The family assembled itself over the following hour, the way the Park household always assembled itself for important occasions. Organically and a little chaotically, and with the underlying warmth of people who genuinely wanted to be in the same room as each other, which was, Zola had long believed, the rarest and most precious quality a family could have. Mr. Park emerged from his study and greeted Zola with the two-handed handshake he had started giving her 3 years ago, which she knew was meaningful because he was not a man who initiated physical contact except with the people he had decided mattered. He and Jun-seo embraced briefly, the embrace of two people who communicated in actions rather than words, brief and firm and complete, like a sentence that didn't need any additional punctuation. Halmoni was helped to her chair at the head of the table and surveyed the assembled company with her usual ancient and unruffled serenity, the serenity of a woman who had seen so much of life that very little of it surprised her anymore, and who occasionally saw things in people that the people hadn't seen yet in themselves. She looked at Zola when she sat down. She looked at Jun-seo when he sat down. She looked at the space between them across the table with an expression Zola couldn't entirely read, though it had the quality of recognition. Suan arrived 23 minutes late, breathless and magnificent, pulling off her coat in the entryway and announcing her tardiness like a press release. I'm sorry. There was a thing with the train and then a different thing and I'm here. Everyone please be calm." "We are calm," said Mr. Park. "Sit down." "You were not calm in your texts," Suan said, sitting down. "I was expressing concern. You used 3 exclamation points, Appa." The table settled into itself. The food came out in Mrs. Park's signature abundance, dish after dish, more than they could finish, because in this house love was measured partly in the gap between what was needed and what was provided, the excess itself a kind of declaration. Zola settled into her usual spot between Suan and Halmoni, and Jun-seo settled across the table, and the conversation began to flow in that easy, layered, overlapping way of people who had been eating together for a very long time and knew each other's rhythms without having to think about it. Zola did something she rarely did at this table, which was listen more than she spoke. She watched Jun-seo with his family. She was a professional, in a way, at watching. Her work required her to understand how emotion moved through a moment, what the sonic texture of a scene should be, and so she had developed over the years a habit of close observation that sometimes forgot to announce itself. She watched how he sat with his father, careful and attentive in a way that was not quite formal but had a respect in it that came from somewhere deep, the respect of a son for a man he had spent years trying to understand. She watched how they spoke to each other in short, complete sentences, neither of them reaching for more words than were necessary, both of them meaning everything they said. She watched how he was with Halmoni, leaning forward when the old woman spoke, not missing a word, answering in Korean that was lower and slower and more careful than the Korean he used with anyone else. She watched how Halmoni's hand came out and patted his arm twice in the way she patted the arms of the people she loved most, and how he covered her hand with his briefly before she drew it back. She watched how he was with Suan, which was her favorite thing to watch. The way Suan had plainly adored her older brother for the entirety of her life and showed it specifically by teasing him without mercy, as though affection and mockery were the same currency exchanged between them. "Your hair is different," Suan announced midway through the meal. "It's the same hair. It looks more serious." "I am more serious." "You could not be more serious. You were already at maximum seriousness when you left." "I've achieved a new level," he said gravely. "It was unlocked after year 4. Suan turned to Zola. "He used to be funny," she said, as though reporting a death. "I'm still funny," Jun-seo said. "He makes excellent eggs," Mrs. Park offered, with the energy of someone providing a character reference. There was a beat of silence. And then Zola, who had been keeping a careful and deliberate hold on herself for the better part of an hour, laughed, genuinely and helplessly, the kind of laugh that came from somewhere below strategy, the kind she could not have held back if she tried. He looked at her when she laughed, directly, immediately, like it was the most natural thing. Not for very long. Not in any way that anyone else at the table would have registered as particular. But he looked, and when she met his eyes there was something in them that was warm and quietly satisfied, like a man who had just confirmed something he had suspected. She looked away first. After dinner, after the dishes were cleared and the table was scattered with fruit peels and empty glasses and the mellowed evidence of a good evening, Zola helped Mrs. Park carry out the siki, the sweet rice punch that tasted like every winter holiday she had spent in this house, like warmth that came from the inside out. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, tray in hand, when she realized she was not alone in the kitchen. Jun-seo was at the sink, washing a serving bowl that was too good to trust to the dishwasher, the way his mother had always washed the good dishes. She had seen Mrs. Park do this exact thing 100 times. Watching him do it in the same unhurried, competent way made something in her chest go very quietly soft. She should have gone back to the table. "How does it feel?" she said instead. "Being home." He didn't answer immediately. He finished the bowl, turned off the tap, dried his hands with the kind of deliberateness she was already starting to recognize as particular to him, doing one thing at a time, fully, before moving on. Then he turned and leaned against the counter and looked at her. "Strange," he said, "but good. Mostly good. The city is the same. The house is the same. Everyone in it is older." He paused. "But it feels like something has been added. Not just time." She tilted her head slightly. "Added. New things. Things I didn't know were here." His eyes moved over her face, not quickly, not in a way that was rude or too much, but in a way that was deliberate and considered, like a person reading something they wanted to understand correctly. "I didn't know about you, for example. Your mother told you about me. She told me Suan had a best friend named Zola, who could win at Jangi and ate more than anyone else at the table, and had been part of this family for 10 years. He paused. "That's different from knowing about you." Zola was aware that her heart was performing small acrobatics that she was choosing, for the moment, not to address. "And what do you know now?" He looked at her steadily. "That I'm interested," he said simply and directly, "in finding out the rest." The words landed in her chest with the precision of something that had been aimed. Not carelessly, not performatively, just honestly, the way she was beginning to understand he said most things. Without decoration. Without the protective layer of ambiguity that most people wrapped their real meanings in. Soo-yeon's voice arrived from the dining room with perfect timing, announcing that she was starting the fruit without them and would not be apologizing for it. Zola turned toward the doorway. Jun-seo pushed off from the counter. They went back to the table, and the evening continued around them, and nothing was said, and nothing happened, and absolutely everything had begun. He texted her on a Monday. He had gotten her number from Soo-yeon, and the reason he gave Soo-yeon was coordination. Their mother's birthday was in November, 6 weeks out, and there were plans to be made. This was true. It was also, Zola would later conclude, approximately 30% of the actual reason. The first text was logistical, practical. The birthday, the dinner, whether she had thoughts about a gift from the two of them combined. She responded. They went back and forth a few times about it. And then something shifted, slowly, so naturally that she couldn't have pointed to the exact message where it happened, and the conversation became something else. Something curious. Something that had the quality of two people who had just discovered an interesting room and were walking through it together, looking at everything. He asked about her work. She told him she was a sound designer, which almost always required some explaining, and she launched into her usual simplified version. She built the audio world that films and games and theatrical productions existed inside. She created the sounds of things that didn't yet exist. She decided what an emotional moment sounded like when you were sitting in the dark watching a story unfold. He was quiet for a moment after she sent that. A full minute, maybe more, which in text conversation was notable. Then, so you decide what a moment sounds like. You're the one choosing what something feels like before people know they're feeling it. She stared at that. At the precision of it, the way he had understood immediately and said it better than she usually said it herself. Exactly, she wrote back. Most people think sound design is just adding music. It's more like building the emotional architecture of a scene. The thing underneath the thing. The thing underneath the thing, he wrote. I want to talk about this in person. She played it very cool. She sent back a simple, sure. And then she put her phone face down on her desk and sat for a moment with the particular feeling of someone who has just agreed to something they already know is going to matter. They met on Tuesday morning at the Korean-owned cafe 3 stops from her studio. It was Soo-yeon who had first taken her there years ago, but Zola had made it her own over time. The owners knew her order. She knew the music they played on Tuesday morning specifically. She had written the audio notes for her best project sitting at the corner table by the window. Jun-seo was already there when she arrived. Of course he was. She got the impression that he was always early everywhere. Not anxiously, but with the easy comfort of someone who liked having a moment to settle before the thing began. He had found the corner table by the window, her table, which she chose to take as a good sign about his instincts. He had her order waiting on her side of the table. She stopped, looked at the cup, looked at him. How did you know? She said. Soo-yeon, he said, the way people said the name of someone who knew too much. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at him over the rim of it and said, You realize this is slightly alarming. Knowing your coffee order? Arriving before me and having it ready like some kind of, like you're the main character. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Would you prefer I arrived after you and made you wait? I would prefer to be surprised by what's possible. Then consider yourself surprised, he said, with the perfect level of calm. I know your coffee order. That's what's possible. She laughed despite herself, and he watched her laugh with an expression that was not quite a smile. Warmer than that, more interior, the expression of a man filing something away. They talked for 2 hours. Intended to talk for 45 minutes and talked for 2 hours, which was the kind of thing that happened when you discovered that the person across the table had a mind that worked in a way you found genuinely interesting. Not because it was like your mind, but because it was different from your mind in ways that were complementary, ways that filled in spaces, offered angles you hadn't thought to look from. She talked about sound. He asked questions that told her he had been listening to everything she'd said in that first text exchange, that he'd been thinking about it since, that he had theories of his own he wanted to test. He asked about the difference between sound that served a scene and sound that created one. He asked whether she could ruin a good film with bad sound design. She told him she absolutely could and had opinions about films that had done exactly that, which became a conversation that lasted 40 minutes on its own. He talked about books. Not in the way people talked about books to seem interesting, not performing it, but in the way of someone for whom reading had been a genuine lifeline, something that kept the interior life alive when the exterior life was very loud and very structured and very far from anything personal. He talked about the books he'd carried through 6 years of service the way other soldiers carried photographs. Stories about people navigating impossible situations with insufficient information. Stories about people trying to hold onto the best version of themselves in contexts designed to strip things away. She asked what it had been like. The service, the years, the being away. He thought about this with the particular gravity he brought to things that deserved it. Necessary, he said finally, for who I was at 24. I needed a structure that was bigger than me I think I needed to learn certain things about myself in a context that didn't allow for avoidance. He paused. But I should have come home more. That's the thing I would change. Why didn't you? He looked out the window at the street, the Tuesday morning street, people moving with their coffees and their particular Tuesday energies. I told myself the timing was never right. There was always another assignment, another reason. The truth is probably that being here, with everything the same and me changed, that felt harder than staying where I knew what was expected of me. Zola sat with that for a moment. That's very honest, she said. I'm trying to be, he said. I've spent 6 years in environments where honesty was valued but it was tactical. You were honest in service of an objective. I'm trying to get back to honesty that doesn't have an objective. Honesty that's just what's true. She looked at him across the table. The morning light was coming through the window at an angle that caught his face just so, and she thought, without deciding to think it, without any warning, that the photographs had not done any justice to the particular quality of his attention, the way being in a conversation with him felt like being in the only conversation that was happening anywhere. What's true right now? She asked, and she didn't entirely know why she asked it, only that it felt like the right question. He looked at her, directly, without hurry. That this was not what I expected, he said. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Suyun's best friend, he said. Someone I would be glad to know and then would see at family dinners. And instead, he said, and then he picked up his coffee and looked at her over it and did not finish the sentence, which she would think about for the rest of the day. They started meeting every Tuesday. This became a fact of both their weeks so gradually and so naturally that neither of them had a conversation about it. It simply became the shape of Tuesdays, the way certain fixtures became the shape of a life without anyone deciding they were permanent. He was always there first. The order was always waiting. She was never as annoyed about this as she theoretically should have been. She started to learn him in the specific and irreversible way you learned people when you paid them close attention. She learned that he was funny in the most understated and devastating way possible, the kind of humor that lived in precision and timing, where the joke arrived so quietly that you were laughing before you'd registered that it had happened. She learned that he laughed at her humor with a genuine, undisguised delight that she found disproportionately gratifying, the way it was always more satisfying to make the serious people laugh. She learned that he had opinions about exactly the things he had thought deeply about and almost none about the things he hadn't, and that he could tell the difference between them, which was rarer than it should have been. She learned that he was working through what came next. He had appointments with university advisors, he was researching graduate programs, he was considering architecture seriously, drawn by something about the way structures held space and created the possibility of certain kinds of living inside them. She found this fascinating for a reason she didn't immediately understand and then did. He was, in a way, interested in what she was interested in. The thing underneath the thing. What a space made you feel before you knew you were feeling it. She told him this one Tuesday morning and he went very still and looked at her the way he sometimes did, like she had said exactly the thing he needed someone to say, and then he looked out the window and said quietly, I hadn't thought about it that way. You design space, she said. I design sound. We're both trying to make people feel something they didn't know they were supposed to feel. He turned back to her. That might be the most interesting thing anyone has said to me in 6 years. The bar in the military is low. He laughed. The real one, The low and unguarded one that she had by now accumulated enough occasions of to know was not given out casually, and she sat in the warmth of having caused it and told herself to stop cataloging these things. She was cataloging everything. She was aware of this and was choosing not to address it. What she was cataloging, specifically and with the discipline of someone who had decided not to lie to herself even when it was inconvenient. The way he held a door open not as a performance but simply because he had registered that a door needed holding and he was closest to it. The way he remembered everything she told him and referenced it later in ways that demonstrated he had been thinking about it in the interim, which was one of the most quietly devastating things a person could do to her. The way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she was distracted by her phone or her coffee or the street outside the window. Not predatorily, not with any agenda. Just with a quality of attention so focused and so warm that the back of her neck prickled when she happened to catch it. She was in some trouble. She understood this with the resigned clarity of a woman who had always been good at diagnosing situations she'd arrived in too late to avoid. The park's kitchen was, in Zola's long experience, the center of gravity of the entire house. This was not a metaphor. This was observable physics. When something important was happening, a celebration, a difficult conversation, a reconciliation, a piece of news that changed the shape of things, it happened in or adjacent to that kitchen. The kitchen was where Mrs. Park processed the world, through the medium of cooking, transforming whatever she was feeling into something that could be eaten and shared and therefore made communal, made survivable. So it made sense, in retrospect, that the kitchen was where things happened between Zola and Jun-seo. It started the third Sunday after he came home, when Zola arrived for dinner and found Jun-seo already in the kitchen helping his mother, and Mrs. Park, with the casual authority of a woman who arranged the world to her preferences, handed Zola an apron and said, "You help Jun-seo with the japshi. He puts in too much sesame oil." "I put in exactly the right amount of sesame oil," Jun-seo said, without looking up from what he was doing. "You are wrong about this," Mrs. Park said pleasantly and left the kitchen. Jun-seo looked at the doorway through which his mother had disappeared. Then he looked at Zola with an expression of profound, long-suffering patience that was somehow also fond. The expression of a person who had been managed by this particular woman for 30 years and had made a comprehensive peace with it. Zola pressed her lips together. "She's not wrong about the sesame oil," she said. "I know," he said. "Don't tell her." She laughed and tied the apron and came to stand beside him at the counter, and for the next hour they worked side by side in that kitchen in a way that felt so natural it was slightly alarming. They fell into an easy division without discussing it. She soaking the glass noodles while he prepared the vegetables, he cooking the beef while she handled the mushrooms and spinach, both of them moving around each other in the compact space with an instinctive awareness of where the other was at any given moment that they had not needed to practice. Mrs. Park appeared in the doorway at one point, surveyed the kitchen, said nothing, and disappeared again with an expression of elaborate neutrality. "She's watching us," Zola said. "She's been watching you since the minute you walked in," Jun-seo said, something light in his voice. "She's been watching you since you came home," Zola replied. "That's different. She's been watching me to check whether I'm okay." He handed her the soy sauce without her asking, because she had reached for it and he had registered the reach before she'd completed it. "She's watching you for a different reason." Zola looked at him sideways. "What reason?" He looked back at her sideways from a distance of approximately 18 inches, which in a kitchen was not very much distance at all. His expression was the composed one, the one that didn't give everything away. But his eyes, she had learned by now, were less composed than the rest of him, and in his eyes was something warm and something amused. Privately, quietly, warmly amused. "I think," he said, "she approves of how the japshi is going." Zola decided to accept this answer and not examine it too carefully. These Sunday kitchen hours became a rhythm. Not every Sunday. Some Sundays Zola arrived to find the cooking already finished and the table already set. But often enough that Mrs. Park began to simply assume Zola would help Jun-seo with whatever task he'd been assigned, and often enough that Zola began to arrive a little earlier than strictly necessary. She told herself this was because she enjoyed cooking. This was true. She also told herself it had nothing to do with the specific quality of his company in that specific space. This was less true, and she was aware of that, and she was choosing, for the moment, to let it be. The conversations they had in that kitchen were different from the Tuesday cafe conversations. The cafe conversations had a slight sense of occasion to them. Two people who had shown up specifically to talk, who were attentive to each other in the alert, slightly heightened way of people who were still learning something. The kitchen conversations had the quality of two people who had somewhere else to be but kept finding things to say, kept extending the conversation past the point where the task required it, kept discovering that there was another thing and then one more thing after that. He told her one Sunday while she was dicing scallions and he was doing something architectural with dumplings, that he had started the architecture program research in earnest, that he had a meeting with an admissions advisor that week, that he was nervous about it in a way he hadn't expected to be, because he hadn't been nervous about much in a long time, and the nervousness reminded him that this was something he actually wanted, and things you actually wanted were more frightening than things you were simply obligated to do. Zola put down her knife. She turned to look at him. "That's exactly right," she said. "When I started building my own client list, I was so much more scared than I was when I was working for someone else. Because if you fail at something someone else wanted, it's their failure. If you fail at something you wanted, it's yours," he said. "It's yours," she agreed. He was looking at her with that quality of attention, the concentrated one. "How did you get past it?" he asked. "The fear of failing at something you wanted." She thought about it honestly. "I decided that the failure would be survivable," she said, "and that not trying because I was afraid was not survivable. Not for the version of me I wanted to be." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to write that down. Please don't. It will make me feel responsible for your entire career trajectory." "You might be," he said simply, and turned back to his dumplings, and Zola turned back to her scallions, and neither of them said anything else about it, but she felt the weight of his words settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. It was Halmoni who said something first. Not in words, Halmoni rarely used words when a look would do, which was the particular economy of someone who had been reading people longer than most people had been alive. She said it on a Sunday in late October, when Zola and Jun-seo were carrying dishes to the table and their hands brushed reaching for the same bowl. Neither of them had been looking, both of them reached at the same time. His hand covered hers briefly and both of them went very still for a fraction of a second, and Halmoni, from her chair at the head of the table, watched this with the expression of someone confirming something they had already known. When Zola went to sit beside her, Halmoni took her hand and held it for a moment and said something in Korean that was too quiet for the others to hear. Zola's Korean was good enough for Sunday dinners and basic conversation, but Halmoni spoke an older Korean, a formal register threaded with idiom and proverb, and Zola caught only parts of what she said. She caught the word for patient. She caught the word for arriving. She thought she caught the word for right in the sense of correct, in the sense of meant to be, but she wasn't entirely sure. She asked Suan about it on the phone that night. Suan was very quiet for a moment. Then she said the river finds its way to the sea eventually, even when it cannot see it yet. Zola held her phone in both hands in the dark of her bedroom. "Halmoni said that to me." "Yes," said Suan. "About your brother." "I didn't say that." "Suan, I'm just reporting what Halmoni said. What you do with it is entirely your business." "Suan, I have to go," said Suan, in the voice of someone who was absolutely not going anywhere. "I have to go. Good night." She played the first voice message 6 times. In her defense, the audio quality was slightly inconsistent and she was a professional who noticed these things. This was not the reason she played it 6 times. The reason she played it 6 times was that his voice, freed from the slight performance of in-person conversation, freed from the context of a table and a coffee cup and the need to have an expression ready when he said something, had a quality she hadn't fully registered before. Something unhurried and real. Something that lived at the bottom of words rather than the surface. He had sent the voice message in response to her text suggesting that his reading choices were depressingly predictable, always men in dire situations making difficult choices. She had texted, "You need to read something fun. Something that isn't people suffering nobly." There had been a pause. And then instead of a text, the voice message, which arrived like he'd decided something. "I read fun things," he said in it. "I read a novel last year about a competitive ballroom dance circuit that I found genuinely thrilling. I have read things with happy endings. I am not opposed to happy endings. I just find that the books that stay with me are the ones about people in extremity, because those are the books that answer the question I'm always quietly asking, which is, what does a person actually consist of? What are they made of when everything else is stripped away? You can't know that from a comfortable life. A pause. That being said, send me something fun. I trust your taste. She played it 6 times. Told herself this was about the audio quality. Sent him 3 book recommendations. Did not sleep particularly well. The voice messages became a feature of their communication, not replacing the texts, but existing alongside them, for the things that didn't fit in text. She was learning, a person who had certain thoughts that wanted to be spoken, that lost something essential when reduced to type. She began sending voice messages back. Small ones at first, quick responses, things that needed a tone the text couldn't carry. Then longer ones. Then, occasionally, messages that she hadn't planned to send, and had sent anyway in the particular loosened state of late nights when her internal sensor was less attentive than it should have been. One night at 11:30, lying on her couch in the dark listening back to a sound cue she'd built that day that wasn't quite right yet, she sent him a message about it. She hadn't meant to. She had been thinking out loud in her apartment the way she did when she was working through a problem, and then she had her phone in her hand, and then the message was sent. There's a scene I'm working on, she said in it. A reunion scene. 2 people who haven't seen each other in a long time. The director wants something swelling and obvious, the kind of sound that tells the audience how to feel. But I keep building something quieter instead. Something that has space in it. Because I think real reunions aren't loud. I think real reunions are actually very quiet because the feeling is too big for noise. You go quiet when something matters that much. A pause where she could hear herself deciding whether to say the next part. I think I'm right about this. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. She sent it. She put her phone face down. She told herself she would not check for a response for at least 20 minutes. His response came in 4 minutes. He sent a voice message back. You're right, he said. I know you're right because I've been in situations that should have been loud. Moments that the movies would have scored with something enormous, and they weren't. They were very quiet. The loudest feeling I've ever had in my life didn't make a sound. A pause. The quality of the pause. She heard him deciding something too. Build it quiet. Fight for the quiet version. The director will thank you later. She listened to it twice. Then she set her phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought, what is happening to me? The conversation with Suan arrived on a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of November like a verdict that had been a long time in the making. They were at Suyeon's apartment, which smelled of the takeout they'd gotten and the particular warm paper smell of Suyeon's books everywhere, and they were ostensibly watching a film on the laptop but were actually talking over it the way they had talked over films for 10 years, the film being primarily a structural excuse to be in the same place. You've been different, Suyeon said, during a pause in the film that neither of them was watching. How different? Zola said. Suyeon considered. You're a little quieter than usual. Not sad quiet, thinking quiet, like there's something running underneath everything else. Zola looked at the laptop screen without seeing it. Jun-seo is coming to Iamoni's birthday dinner, Suyeon said, in a very careful, very deliberate voice that was trying very hard to sound like it was saying something casual. He mentioned he was helping you plan it. We're making the cake together. The silence that followed this statement was the loudest silence Zola had experienced since a sound design workshop she'd attended where they'd built an anechoic chamber. The cake, said Suyeon. The honey cake. Your mom's favorite. Together, said Suyeon. At his apartment. On Saturday. Another silence. Zola, said Suyeon. Suyeon. I need to say something and I need you to let me say all of it before you respond. Zola turned from the laptop to look at her best friend. Suyeon was sitting with her legs crossed and her hands in her lap and the particular expression she wore when she was about to say something she had prepared. She was the most prepared person Zola had ever known. She prepared for conversations the way other people prepared for presentations. I've known you for 10 years, Suyeon said. I know your face. I know your voice. I know what you sound like when you're interested in something and trying to pretend you're not, because you've always been a terrible liar about the things that actually matter to you, even though you're very good at performing certainty about everything else. She paused. And I know what you sound like when you say someone's name. Zola said nothing. You say his name differently, Suan said. You say Jun-seo the way you say the name of a project you care about. The way you say the name of a piece of music that got into your head. There's a quality to it. She paused again. I'm not making this up. I wouldn't make this up about something this important. It's your brother, Zola said. Not defensively. Just putting the fact on the table. It's my brother, Suan agreed. And you are my best friend. And those are both things I have thought about at length, because you matter too much to me to be anything other than completely honest about this. She met Zola's eyes. He is a good man. You know, I don't say that carelessly. He is genuinely, fundamentally good in the way that takes effort and intention. He was good at 24 and he has spent 6 years working to be better, which is the kind of thing a person only does if they are paying attention to themselves honestly. She paused. And he needs someone who sees him, not who manages him, not who admires the version of him that's easiest to admire. Someone who sees the actual man. And you, Zola, you see people. You see them better than anyone I know. It's your gift and your job and your entire way of being in the world. Zola looked at her hands. They were in her lap and she was looking at them and she was feeling the particular feeling of someone who has been given permission for something they had been holding very carefully. Like the moment when you set down a thing you've been carrying for a long time and your arms feel suddenly surprisingly light. What if it doesn't work? She said. It was not the question she'd planned to ask. Came out because it was the real one. Then you are both adults who will have handled it with honesty and care, Suan said, without hesitation. And I will still be your best friend and he will still be my brother and we will all still be at the table together, because this family does not work by subtraction. She reached out and covered Zola's hand with hers, the way Halmoni sometimes did, and the similarity was so striking that Zola felt something tighten in her throat. I am telling you this because I love you both, not instead of one another. Both. Zola looked at her for a long moment, her best friend of 10 years, who had picked up her dropped highlighters and changed everything. He sent me a voice message at 11:30 at night, Zola said. About the nature of quiet. Suan blinked. I'm sorry. About how the loudest feelings don't make sounds. Suan stared at her. He said that. In a voice message. Jun-seo sent you a voice message at 11:30 at night about feelings being quiet. About moments that should be loud being quiet. Suan put her face in her hands. What? Said Zola. He hasn't talked about feelings in any form for as long as I have been alive, Suan said, into her hands. He once refused to discuss the plot of a romantic film for 40 minutes at a family dinner, because he said he didn't have an opinion. He does not send voice messages. He sends texts. He sends very short, factual texts. She lifted her face from her hands. Her expression was the expression of someone who had suspected something and just received confirmation. Oh, Zola. I know, said Zola. He's just. I know, Suan. You have to tell him, Suan said. Or let him tell you, because he is going to tell you. I know my brother. He is working his way toward something and he does everything slowly and thoroughly and correctly when it matters to him. I know, said Zola softly. I think I know. Suan sat back. She looked at her best friend with the particular look of someone who is very happy and is trying to appear measured about it and is not succeeding. Good, she said. Then, because she was Suan, I told you. His apartment on the Saturday morning of the cake was the kind of space that told you exactly who someone was without them having to say it. Spare, but not cold. Everything present had been chosen. Nothing had simply accumulated. The bookshelves he'd built himself from pale wood and black brackets took up an entire wall. The books double-stacked in the way of someone who had more of them than space for them and considered this a reasonable problem to have. There was a reading chair by the window, good light, the right angle, and a small, clean kitchen that looked onto a narrow street where the last of the November leaves were coming down in slow arcs, gold against gray. It felt, in a way she couldn't have fully articulated, like him. Like the physical form of his particular quality of attention. Everything in its right place. Enough space to breathe. The honey cake was supposed to be elegant. A Korean honey cake, the kind Mrs. Park loved, with layers and a glossy finish and decorative piping that demonstrated care and skill. The recipe they had found had made this seem achievable. The recipe, as it turned out, had been overconfident. They were 20 minutes into it when it became clear that neither of them had a fully accurate sense of what fold gently meant in practical terms, which became clear when Zola folded with too much conviction and the batter made an aggressive sound. Was that supposed to happen? Jun-seo said. Absolutely, Zola said, with total false certainty. He looked at the batter. He looked at her. He said nothing, which was worse than if he'd said something, because the silence had a quality of extremely restrained amusement. Don't, she said. I didn't say anything. You said it with your face. I have a very neutral face. You have a face that says things when you're trying to be neutral, she said. It's a whole separate communication system. I've been studying it for weeks. He was quiet again, and this time there was something in his expression that was less neutral still, less restrained, more open, a little bit affected, she thought, like that had landed somewhere. They recovered the batter and got it into the pans and into the oven, and while they waited they tried to make the frosting, which went better, which they celebrated by tasting it off respective spoons and pronouncing it correctly sweet. And then the mixer, finishing the second batch of frosting, made a decision about velocity, and a plume of cream went across the counter and across Zola's sleeve and, impressively, up into her collar. There was a moment of absolute silence. And then they were both laughing. Actually laughing, the kind that took over your whole body, that made you lean on the nearest available surface. She leaned on the counter. He leaned on the counter beside her and laughed with his head slightly bowed and his shoulders moving. The laugh she had been collecting for 2 months. The one that was completely unguarded. When it subsided, he reached past her for the kitchen towel that was hanging from the oven handle, and he turned back and began, without asking, to clean the frosting from her sleeve. His touch was careful. He was paying attention to what he was doing, not to her face, to the sleeve, and she was paying attention to his face precisely because he wasn't looking at hers, the particular freedom of being able to look at someone when they don't know you're looking. He was lovely, she thought. Not in a way that had to do with his face, though that was fine. More in the way of him. The way he was thorough about a small thing. The way he had reached for the towel without asking permission because the question was self-evident. The way his hands were gentle on a task that didn't require gentleness but received it anyway. He looked up from the sleeve. They were, in the compact geography of his kitchen, close. The kind of close that required an acknowledgement or a stepping back, and neither of them stepped back. Jun-seo, she said. Zola, he said. Her voice was lower than she'd intended. What are we doing? It was not entirely a question. He heard that. He folded the towel and set it on the counter with the deliberateness of someone who needed a moment to say something correctly. I have been trying to figure out, he said, how to say something for about 2 months. Okay. I'm not naturally good at this, saying things like this. He looked at her steadily. I'm better at actions than at naming what the actions mean. But I've been told, and I think it's right, that I'm trying to do things differently now. Not just act. Say what things mean. She waited. You are the first thing I look forward to, he said. Every week. The week has a shape now because of you, and without you in it, the shape doesn't make sense. His voice was even and quiet, but there was something underneath it that was neither even nor quiet. Something she could hear as clearly as if she'd built the sound of it herself. I think about what you would think about things. I hear things and I want to tell you about them. I sit at that window and I think about what the sound of this street would be if you were the one deciding. He paused. I know this is your best friend's family. I know what you've built here and what it means. I'm not asking you to risk any of that. I needed you to know what's been true for me since October. The kitchen was warm. The oven was doing something fragrant and promising. Outside his window the leaves were still falling on the narrow street, slow and unhurried, in no particular rush to arrive. She said, You came home and walked into that kitchen and looked at me like I was the answer to a question you'd been carrying for years. Something moved across his face. Something deep and recognizing. Something that looked like arriving. Yes, he said. Exactly that. I've been waiting, she said, for someone to look at me like that for my whole life. I didn't expect him to be my best friend's brother who I'd never met. Is that a problem? He said. and there was something careful and quiet in how he asked it. "I talked to Soo-yun," she said. He held her gaze. "And she said that I see people for a living, and that you need someone who actually sees you." She paused. "She's not wrong about either thing." "She's almost never wrong," he said. "It's infuriating." "She knows," Zola said, something almost like a smile. "She always knows." Zola looked at him. The warm kitchen and the smell of honey cake from the oven and the narrow street outside the window and this man who had walked out of a photograph 2 months ago and had been patiently, thoroughly, inexorably becoming someone she didn't want to see from a distance. "I want to find out what this is," she said. "I want to find out if you are what I think you are." "What do you think I am?" She thought about it honestly. "I think you are the most careful and the most serious and the most quietly funny person I've encountered in years. I think you listen like it means something. I think you are in the middle of figuring out who you are when you're not being what someone else needs, and I think that's brave and I think it's fascinating. And I would like very much to be present for it, to be part of it." She held his gaze. "If you're certain, I am not a person you try out. I don't do provisional." "I know," he said without hesitation. "I'm certain. I've been certain since October. I've just been," he paused, "finding the right way to tell you." "Well," she said, "you found it." He reached out then, slowly, giving her the full time of the motion to know what was happening, giving her every opportunity to let it or not let it, and tucked a loose lock gently behind her ear. His fingers brushed her temple. Barely anything. The lightest possible touch, given with the most possible care. She felt it everywhere. Neither of them moved for a moment. And then the oven timer went off, which was so perfectly timed that they both looked at it and then looked at each other and started laughing again, the good kind, the released kind, and he went to get the cake and she leaned against the counter and watched him and thought, "There it is. That's the beginning of something." The cake came out lopsided. Magnificently, perfectly lopsided. They frosted it together, standing side by side in his kitchen, and the decorative flowers she piped on the top were flowers in the same generous way that clouds were sheep. Technically, if you committed to the interpretation, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever helped make. The dinner table that evening was the fullest it had been in years. Mrs. Park's birthday was always a production. Food in quantities that suggested she expected stragglers, flowers on the table, the good dishes out, the family assembled from its various distances and directions like birds returning to a particular branch they'd always known was theirs. But this year there was something additional in the air, a kind of charged warmth that Zola felt the moment she walked in, that had nothing to do with the decorations and everything to do with the particular quality of a family that was complete again in a way it hadn't been for 6 years. Jun-seo carried the cake in from the car in a box Zola held open with elaborate ceremony, as though they were transporting something fragile and irreplaceable, which it was. They set it in the kitchen. Mrs. Park was not allowed to see it until after dinner, a rule she agreed to with the dignity of a woman who intended to peek and had already identified the angle. Dinner was everything it always was in this house. Abundant and warm and slightly chaotic in the best way. Multiple conversations happening at different volumes. Food being passed and plates being refilled before they were empty. Soo-yun being exactly as loud as she always was and Mr. Park being exactly as measured and Halmoni watching everything from her chair with those clear, deep eyes that saw. Zola was at her usual place between Soo-yun and Halmoni. Jun-seo was across the table. And the difference tonight, the only real difference, was that she was no longer pretending she wasn't aware of him, was no longer spending energy on the management of what showed on her face when she looked at him. She had put down that particular weight in his kitchen that morning, and the absence of it felt like setting down something heavy you'd been carrying for so long you'd forgotten you were carrying it. Soo-yun noticed within the first 5 minutes. Zola saw her notice, a slight stillness, a look across the table at her brother, a look back at Zola, and then the expression of someone who was exercising enormous restraint in real time. Zola met her eyes. Soo-yun raised her water glass very slightly. Zola looked away before she smiled. She didn't entirely succeed. Halfway through dinner, Jun-seo said something across the table to her. A quiet aside about the japshi, about which of them deserved more credit. A conversation they had been having privately for weeks that the rest of the table wasn't aware of, and she answered it in the same register, low and specific and meant for him, and she saw Mr. Park observe this exchange with a slight movement of his head, A fractional adjustment of his attention. The particular way of a father who has noticed. Something about his son that makes him look again. Mr. Park, later, would find occasion to stand near Zola in the kitchen while she was helping clear the dessert plates. And he would say, without looking at her, "You are good for him." For words. Unembellished. She understood that this was one of the most significant things he had said to anyone in a long time, and she received it accordingly. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded. He went back to the table. That was all. The cake emerged after dinner, carried from the kitchen by Jun-seo while Zola held the door open, and it was greeted by the table with the warm enthusiasm of people who understood that the lopsidedness was not a flaw but evidence. Evidence of time spent, of two people in a small kitchen making something together, of the particular beauty of an imperfect thing made with complete intention. Mrs. Park looked at the cake for a long moment. She looked at Jun-seo. She looked at Zola. She looked at the flowers piped on top that were flowers in spirit, if not entirely in execution. Her eyes were bright. "You made this together," she said. "Yes," they said at the same moment, which nobody missed. Mrs. Park made a sound that was not quite a word. She picked up the lighter and lit the candles herself, slowly, all of them, and she looked at each flame for a second before moving to the next one. And everyone at the table was quiet with the particular quiet of a room full of people who understand that a moment is happening. She blew them out. The smoke curled up in the warm air of the dining room. "Beautiful," she said, and meant all of it. They ended up on the back porch after dinner the way they often ended up in the kitchen, without deciding to, through the natural gravity of two people who kept finding themselves in the same place. He had brought tea. 2 cups without asking because he knew, and she had stopped being startled by the fact that he knew things about her without being told, had begun instead to simply receive it as one received anything that was just true. They sat on the back step, side by side, shoulders close in the cold November dark. He had put his jacket over her shoulders before they came out. Not as a gesture, as a fact. It was cold and she was cold and the jacket was available and he had put it over her shoulders and she had said thank you and they had come outside and that was all. And yet she was wearing it now and it was warm and it smelled unmistakably of him and she understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent months listening carefully, exactly what that meant and exactly how she felt about it. The garden was quiet. The persimmon tree stood at its usual station. The herbs were covered against the cold. Above the rooftops, the sky was clear and the stars were present in that particular winter way, sharper than they'd be in summer, more distinct. "This is my favorite part of their house," she said. "Even in November? Especially in November, when it's warm inside and cold out here and you can hear the difference." She wrapped her hands around her tea. "The sound of warmth is partly contrast. You need the cold to make the warmth legible." He turned to look at her. She could feel him looking. "That sounds like something you'd put in a sound cue." "I might have been storing it," she admitted. A pause that was not empty but full. "Tell me what you're building right now," he said. "The actual project." She told him. She had been reluctant, in the early weeks of knowing him, to talk about the work in any detail, partly because it required being specific and partly because being specific about things you cared about was an act of exposure, and she had been protecting herself from exposing anything too quickly. But that reluctance had been dissolving for weeks, worn away by the steady and complete quality of his attention, by the way he received what she told him without flattening it, without simplifying it into something more manageable. He let things be complex. He was not made uncomfortable by complexity. She told him about the film, a quiet, intimate story about a woman returning to her hometown after many years away, and about the sound language she had been building for it, the specific audio grammar that would run underneath the narrative and do the emotional work that the director's restrained visual style deliberately didn't. She told him about the scene she'd been struggling with for 2 weeks, the pivotal scene, the one where the character stands in her childhood kitchen and everything she has been not feeling for the entire film finally arrives. "What does arriving feel like?" he asked. She looked at him. "Sonically," he said, though the word was not quite anchored, not quite only about the sound design. She thought about it. She thought about the Tuesday voice message. She thought about the kitchen that morning. She thought about the way the oven timer had gone off at precisely the right moment and they had both laughed and the laughing had been the sound of something releasing, something that had been held carefully for too long. Quiet first, she said. And then something underneath the quiet. Something that's been there the whole time but that you could only hear because everything else finally stopped. She paused. Not swelling. Not big. Just present. Just real. He was looking at her in the dark with the warmth she had learned was particular to him. The warmth that didn't ask for anything back but simply offered, simply was. Build it that way, he said softly. Whatever they tell you, build it the way you know it is. She looked at him for a moment. The cold was very still around them. You're going to be a very good architect, she said. You understand what a space is supposed to do. I had a good teacher, he said. And then, before she could answer, you're the teacher, in case that wasn't clear. She laughed. The warmth of it surprised her. The ease of it, the way being with him had become the easiest thing she did all week. He shifted slightly on the step, turning toward her more fully, and she turned toward him, and they were looking at each other in the cold dark of the back porch with the warm house behind them and 10 years of this family's love all around them, and she felt the enormous and complete rightness of it. The thing she had been building a sound for without knowing it. The thing that was quiet first and then present, just real. I need to say something to you, she said. Okay, he said, which was the way he always said okay, like a door opening. I don't do things halfway. I don't do uncertain. I don't do provisional. She held his gaze. If I'm in something, I'm in it. That's my whole self. That's the full weight of it. That's not something I modulate or manage or keep in reserve. She paused. I need you to know that before you decide anything. Not because I'm warning you. Because I think you should know exactly what you're choosing. He didn't look away. He didn't blink. He looked at her with the full and unhurried intensity of his particular attention. The kind that took its time because it was serious about accuracy. I know, he said. I've known that since October. That's part of why. He stopped, started again. I'm not a person who does things halfway either. I have never in my life committed to something I intended to leave. That's the reason I was in the military for 6 years. I stayed because I had given my word, and I don't give it lightly. His voice was quiet and even and entirely certain. I know what I'm choosing. I chose it 2 months ago. I've been trying to find the right moment to say so clearly. This is the moment, she said. Yes, he said. I think so. She reached over and took his hand. His hand was warm and large and solid, and he turned his palm up the second she reached for it. Immediately, naturally, the way something returns to the position it was always supposed to be in. They held hands on the back porch of his parents' house in the November dark, and neither of them said anything, and it was the loudest quiet Zola had ever heard. From inside the house, through the glass of the back door, she could see the warm light of the dining room and Soo-yeon's animated gesticulating and Mr. Park's composed attention and Mrs. Park moving between the table and the kitchen with the satisfaction of a woman whose table was full. She could see Halmoni in her chair. Halmoni was looking at the back door. She couldn't see clearly enough to be certain, but she thought, she was almost certain, that Halmoni was smiling. Winter came in properly that year, settling over the city with its particular combination of gray skies and early dark and the way cold air carried sound differently, more cleanly, so that the city at night rang with its own noise in a way it didn't in the softer seasons. Zola had always loved winter sound. The way it was precise. The way it didn't blur. Things had the clarity of winter between them now that they had been said. He came to her studio once in December because she asked him and because he was curious and because she wanted him to see the place where she worked the way he had let her see his apartment, the place where you understood something about a person that the outside world didn't show you. The studio was on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled of coffee and old wood. In the room she had rented for 5 years and made entirely hers. There were plants everywhere, which was not what people expected from a sound studio, and equipment along one wall and a battered sofa along the other and the corner table where she did her best thinking. The acoustic treatment on the walls made the room particularly quiet, the kind of quiet that had texture, that wasn't empty but was held. He stood in the middle of it and turned in a slow circle, looking at everything the way he looked at everything, taking it in. It's quiet, he said. That's intentional. You need the quiet to hear what you're building. I need the quiet to hear what's already there, she said. I don't build sounds from nothing. I find what's already in a scene, what the silence is made of, and I respond to it. The quiet is where the material is. He turned to look at her. The winter light through the studio window was flat and gray and made the room feel like the inside of something held. "Can I hear something?" he said. "Something you made." She hesitated for only a second. Then she sat at the console and found the cue she'd been building for the reunion scene. The one she had texted him about at 11:30 at night. The one she'd built quiet, the way she knew it was. She put it through the studio monitors. The room filled with something that was barely there. A low-frequency hum that was at the edge of perception. The distant ambient sound of a house, a refrigerator somewhere. Footsteps, approaching slowly. And underneath all of it, so quiet it was almost not there, almost just feeling rather than sound. A tone. A single, sustained, barely there tone that was warm in frequency, the frequency of a cello played very softly in a very large room. It lasted 30 seconds. Then it was gone. He stood in the studio in the silence that followed, and she sat at the console and watched him. "That's what it feels like," he said finally. "That's exactly right." She knew that he was not only talking about the scene. "I know," she said. He crossed the room. He sat beside her on the battered studio sofa, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she leaned into him by approximately 5 degrees, a small and voluntary tilt, and he put his arm around her and she felt him exhale. Slowly, completely, like a person setting down something they had been carrying for years. They sat in the acoustic quiet of her studio and listened to the winter outside the window, and she thought, "This is the sound of it. This is what I would build if someone asked me to score this moment. This exact quiet, with the warmth in the frequency, with the feeling of something that has been approaching for a long time finally arriving and finding everything ready." The family dinner at Christmas was the fullest the Parks house had been in years. There were cousins Zola had met before and cousins she hadn't, an aunt and uncle from 2 hours away, the neighbor from next door who had been coming to the Parks Christmas for 15 years and was at this point simply family, and there was Suan at maximum operational volume, and there was Mr. Park presiding over his table with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had everything he wanted in the room with him, and there was Mrs. Park in her kitchen producing miracles, and there was Halmoni at the head of the table seeing everything she had ever needed to see. And there was Zola in her usual spot, except that now Jun-seo was beside her instead of across the table, because Mrs. Park had set the table that way without comment, the way she did all things, as a statement of fact, as a declaration of how things were. Suyan had looked at the seating arrangement when she sat down, and then looked at Zola, and then looked at the ceiling, and then composed herself. "I told you," she said very quietly, for Zola's ears only. "You told me," Zola agreed. "I am always right about these things. You are almost never right about anything else. I'm right about the things that matter." Under the table, Jun-seo's hand found hers without him looking, without either of them making it a moment. Just a hand finding its place, settling there, staying. Halmoni, at the head of the table, reached out and touched Zola's arm as the meal was beginning. The gentle double pat of the woman who had been watching this for months, who had seen it coming before anyone else had known there was something to see. She said something in her low, formal Korean, too quiet for the noise of the table to carry. This time Zola caught more of it. She caught the word for river. She caught the word for sea. She caught something that she thought might be, it finds its way. She caught the word for right. Spring came with the particular extravagance it reserved for cities that had been cold too long. The trees on the street outside Zola's apartment produced blossoms that lasted exactly 9 days before the wind took them, filling the sidewalk with white and pale pink that she walked through every morning on the way to the studio, and every morning she thought about sound and what the sound of arrival was, and every morning she thought she was getting closer to the answer. She was building a new project. Not a film this time, a theater piece, immersive, the kind where the audience moved through rooms and the sound changed as they moved, as though the rooms themselves were speaking. The director had given her a single brief. It should feel like remembering something you didn't know you'd forgotten. She had known immediately what the sound of that was. She had been building it for months without knowing that was what she was doing. Her mother called on a Sunday afternoon, reaching her between the morning and evening passes of the day, and asked how she was and how work was, and then asked, in the particular way mothers asked the question that was the real question. "How are things with that man you keep mentioning but think you're not mentioning?" Zola was sitting in her reading chair by the window with the spring afternoon coming through the glass at a warm angle, and she could hear, From 2 floors below, the street sounds of the city on a Sunday, traffic and voices and someone's music from a window and the specific bright clarity of birds. She said, I think about him the way I think about a piece of music that got into my head. Except he's not only in my head. He's actually here. He shows up on Tuesday mornings with the coffee already waiting and I fake being annoyed about it and he pretends to believe me. He sends me voice messages at unreasonable hours about the nature of feeling things quietly. He comes to my studio and listens to things I built and tells me I got it right, which is the most I've ever needed anyone to tell me about my work. He met my father and they talked for an hour about structural integrity and I'm still not entirely sure if they were talking about buildings. She stopped. Her mother said, and I think Zola said, that the thing I have spent my entire career understanding about sound is that the most important frequencies are the ones just below perception. The ones you feel before you hear them. The ones that are doing all the real work while everyone's attention is on the surface. And I think that's what this is. I think I have been living at the surface of things and he is the frequency underneath that I've been feeling for months without understanding what it was. A pause. Her mother said, That's the most beautiful thing you have ever said to me. Zola laughed. That's not a high bar, she said. You have to recalibrate your expectations of me. But her mother was right, she thought after she hung up. It was the truest thing she had said in years. Maybe ever. The truest thing spoken out loud, into the air, where it became real by virtue of being heard. She called Jun-seo. He picked up on the second ring, which she had stopped pretending not to notice. Hey, she said. Hey, he said. His voice in the afternoon had the same quality as his voice at 11:30 at night and his voice across a dinner table and his voice in the cold dark of the back porch. Unhurried, warm, entirely present. The voice of someone who answered calls the way he turned his palm up. Immediately, naturally, as though he had been ready. What are you doing? She said. Reading, he said. Something fun. You would be proud of me. How fun. There's a wedding in chapter 4, he said. I'm not going to comment on how I feel about it. You love it. A pause. I have no comment on that. She smiled. Outside her window, the spring street was doing all its spring things. All the small industrious activities of a city that had been waiting for warmth and was now making up for lost time. A child went by on a scooter. A dog went by in the opposite direction. 2 people stood outside the coffee shop below and talked with the gestures of people who had something important to work out. Come over for dinner, she said. I'll cook. Something that isn't just rice. That, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, the slow, warm one, the one she had been collecting since October. Sounds exactly right. She hung up the phone. She sat for a moment in the spring afternoon light of her reading chair, in the life she had built, in the particular warmth of knowing exactly what was coming and wanting it, choosing it, having chosen it with the full and unhurried weight of herself. Then she got up to start dinner. Some things, she thought, beginning to move around her kitchen with the easy pleasure of someone who liked being in their own space. Some things were not surprises. Not really. They felt like surprises because you hadn't had the language for them yet, because you had been building the sound of them for years without knowing what you were building toward. And then someone walked out of a photograph and into a kitchen on an autumn afternoon, and looked at you, and the frequency you'd been feeling below the surface of everything finally resolved into something you could hear. Something quiet first. And then underneath the quiet, the thing that had always been there. Present. Just real. And the sound of it, if she were designing it, if she were building the score of this particular scene, this particular life, was not swelling, was not enormous, was not the thing you expected when something important arrived. It was a door opening. The weight of a jacket around your shoulders. A hand found in the dark turning palm up without being asked. A coffee waiting on a Tuesday morning, patient and certain, ready before you'd arrived. It was the sound of someone who knew you were coming. It was the sound of home. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, leave us a comment. Also like, share and subscribe to our channel, and click on the notification bell to get notified whenever a new story is made.